So thank you. I appreciate all of you being here. How many of you were here for Frederick Abal's discussion strategy talk just a short while ago? Handful of you? Okay. So there are going to be some similarities, but I'm going to be coming at it from a slightly different angle. Frederick probably warned you that this is not Steve Wilhite. It's really Dr. Evil. Okay? Here to talk about from a different perspective of utilities and what's happening on the grid. All right? But I'm going to prove to you over the next 30 minutes that it's really not evil. I'm just going to do three things. I want to paint a little bit about the changing landscape. You've heard Jean-Pascal talk about this morning if you were here for his plenary. You've heard Frederick Abal talk about this. Maybe some of the other sessions discuss the disruption in the marketplace and the space. So I'm going to touch a little bit on that, but I also want to touch on where I think it's going, where we think it's going, where it might wind up. This isn't all fact, but at least I'll push you a little bit in your thinking to talk about where we think it's going. And the third piece then is what end users specifically should be doing about it and what companies are doing about it. And I'll give a few examples, a few personal stories along the way as well. I know Frederick was talking about it more from the DSOs and from the utility and the supplier perspective. I'll incorporate some of that into mine as well, but largely coming at it from the perspective of the end user or the consumer. So as the slide says, I'm not Dr. Evil, I'm Steve Wilhite, and I have the privilege of leading the Energy and Sustainability Services Group within Schneider. We're a global team of a couple thousand people spread out around the world. We're operating in well over 100 countries and serving largely global types of companies, but companies with multiple sites and a footprint that tends to be more complex. All right? So as we click through this, one of the key things that you've heard about and talked about while you've been here, in all likelihood, is how this electricity landscape is changing. And Frederick talked about this a little bit as well, but it's a prime example of Industry 4.0, or the Industrial Revolution, or this next phase, and what role electricity is playing in this. And so as we go through this today, I want you to keep that context alive in your mind as you think about what's actually changing. So just a bit of a rewind to talk about this industrial landscape and what we've seen change from 1.0 to 4.0. So when you think about 1.0, a few hundred years ago, we saw the introduction of steam power, okay? And that's where things really started to change initially in the first industrial revolution. We had the steam engine, and we had disruption taking place in the 1700s with the advent of that. Then along comes electric power, late 1800s. 2.0 and the dramatic changes, we saw centralized systems come into play. We saw the transmission and distribution systems start to become popular. And largely for these last 100 years or so, that industry, this industry, and I think Frederick talked about this as well, has remained largely unchanged. The single biggest disrupting factor over this last 100 years has been the liberalization of markets. So it's been more a business model issue than a fundamental physical change that's taken place in the landscape. Now we find ourselves on the verge of 4.0, but in thinking about 3.0, we see the advent of computing power taking place. And for those of you in this room, including myself, that are old enough to remember putting a man on the moon, you know, it's amazing to think that within each of our pockets or purses or backpacks, we carry more computing power than what it took to put a human being on the moon. And I remind my kids of that on that rare occasion that I happen to be home when they head off to school that particular day and tell them, you better not mess this up because you have more computing power in your phone than we did to put a human being on the moon. So we see these fundamental changes and it's accelerating all the faster. So the pace at which these changes are taking place, it's getting much blurrier. And now we find ourselves in 4.0. With the advent of IoT, the Internet of Things, IIoT, you see all kinds of things changing and taking place that's creating a completely different world. You see on the screen some of these things around artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, robotics coming into play, autonomous vehicles, hopefully not crashing and hurting people. We see quantum computing, nanotechnologies coming into play, and then more in the business model world, we see peer-to-peer transactional systems and networks, and we'll come back to that a little bit deeper. But all of this is contributing to an environment where the physical world is becoming blurred with the digital world. And I was talking with somebody just a few minutes before this started about this blurring of the digital and the physical world. It reminds me, hopefully you might all be familiar, or maybe most of you familiar with that movie, The Matrix. It's amazing to think that that movie in The Matrix is 20 years old. And if you think about the lead actor in that movie, Keanu Reeves, playing the part of Neo in that movie, that whole movie was about the blurring of the physical and the digital world, where you weren't really sure, even he wasn't sure at times, what world he was existing in. And here we are 20 years later, dealing with some of these same issues on the digital side and the physical side, and these worlds getting blurrier. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. But now I find myself, I'm in the Schneider matrix now, and I feel like on particular days, I may feel like Keanu Reeves. And I would encourage you to go out to the booth to visit the NEO, because we actually have an offer launch called the NEO. It stands for New Energy Opportunities, not to be mixed up with the character Neo in the movie The Matrix. Although at times we do feel like we're dodging bullets. But the worlds are blurring, and they're coming together in a much different way than they have in the past. So the requirements of us, in terms of how we deal with this, will be substantially different tomorrow than it is today. Here's just some of the fun facts. Today we measure the IoT devices and these connected things in the billions, okay? There's different measures. Some might say it's 8 billion, some might say it's 10 billion, okay? But the bottom line is 10 years from now, when we put this slide up, the measurement will be in the trillions, okay? In fact, it'll get to a point where there just won't be any reason to count anymore. It'll be measured in infinite number of devices that are connected when you stop and think about what all of us carry in our pockets, what we have in our homes, what we have in our workplaces, and how we function physically in this increasingly digital world. It's going to be massive. You see some of these other statistics up here, artificial intelligence. Some of you might have read the article not too long ago about Google increasing the efficiency of their cooling systems by 40% using artificial intelligence and predictive algorithms to more efficiently run their data centers. See, energy storage growing from 5 to 300 gigawatt hours over the next 15 years. So the cost of storage, the cost of lithium or other mechanisms for storage is dropping dramatically, completely changing this landscape. Frederick referred to this as well, because historically this business was simple. It was unidirectional, it was one way, we generated it centrally, we transmitted it, we distributed it, and end users used it and consumed it. Now all of a sudden it's mixing. And we'll come back to that in a second as well. More than 1 million of your neighbors in Germany today are functioning in their own mini grid, if you will, where they have their own sources of supply in the form of PVs, and they're interacting on a peer-to-peer basis where they're finding different ways of monetizing those assets, and at the same time that they're finding different ways of consuming and producing electricity. So this ecosystem is changing. It's changing dramatically. And when you think about today's ecosystem, sometimes it's kind of fun to look at these pictures of the globe and you step back and it still looks the same. You still see the hot spots, the bright spots. So a lot of that hasn't changed. So I would argue that much of this fundamental change, while a lot is happening technologically, it's really also a business model shift that's changing. One of Frederick's slides that he put up earlier talked about how utilities and suppliers are having to find and create different revenue streams as they see revenue streams from the traditional utility business changing and shifting. Well, the lights are still on when you take this picture. They might be more efficiently run, but that physical end of it is still functioning much the same way. So what's shifting really, in this case, the business models, I would say, are driving more of the change than simply the technology. So you have both when you look at Industry 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0. You have different things pushing and driving the substantial change that we all feel in this ecosystem. And I would argue as much as anything right now, it's a business model shift as much as it's a technology shift. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what we call the mesh grid ecosystem. So up on the screen here, you see the advent or the influence of more microgrids coming into place. There was discussion about that yesterday in one of the panels, even nanogrids, much smaller instances of microgrids and IoT devices coming into play in what we call the mesh grid, which is a decentralized, open ecosystem that enables the exchange of energy on a peer-to-peer basis and including the balancing of supply and demand equation that will create new revenue streams and new business models and new opportunities for everyone in the landscape. So again, I'll refer back to one of Frederick's slides where he talked about the changing revenue streams for utilities. So this is where you might feel a bit of the tension between end users who want more control over their future, more control over their environment, more control over their economic picture, and you have the traditional utility mindset, which has really had control of the pricing, had control of the grid, balancing it in a very safe and effective way. And you find these business models starting to clash, and the clashing enabled by the advent of technology and new business models coming into play in different ways in this ecosystem. So as you think about this ecosystem and what it'll look like from the future, again, when you back up from it, the globe still looks the same. But the deeper you drill into it, the more you see some of these experiments taking place in a different way. So when we talk about the mesh grid, just to make it practical, traditionally, if you look on the left side of the screen, you see the traditional centralized grid generating systems that have served us extremely well over the course of these past 100 years. On the right-hand side, in the green bubbles, you see the end-use consumption activities that take place, or the assets. I would argue that this blurring effect that's taking place in the physical side and the digital side is also a blurring effect of these assets, because every one of us are prosumers also. We all have batteries on us right now. So at any given point in time, we may be producing and we may be consuming when we plug that device back in. And this world is blending and mixing. So there is going to come a day, there is a day here now in many places where I can say, you know what, I'd like to sell the output of my rooftop solar unit to my neighbor down the street. And so I start to enact and transact on a peer-to-peer basis as opposed to the grid or an operator of the grid or a controller of the grid also controlling my pricing. This is what we mean by the mesh grid, where assets and energy start to mesh in a new and different way. And it's driven very much by the prosumer or the consumer who has the ability to generate and operate and control their own sources of supply. This is what makes it fun. I'm going to shift gears just for a second and talk about another example of disruption. Okay, all of you hopefully are familiar with Blockbuster. Okay, I can remember Friday nights, my wife and I would jockey for who would have to stop at Blockbuster to pick up a movie on the way home. And every one of us have experienced walking in and you see the new release portion of the shelf that's empty. Well, I shouldn't say every one of us because some of us are too young to remember this, but the new release portion is empty. Why? Everybody's checked them out. I've had to take the time and stop to get it, only to find out that the movie I was hoping to pick up wasn't there. Along comes Netflix. Netflix comes in and starts to disrupt the market. What did they do? They attacked it from a convenience and control perspective first. I want to control what I'm going to watch. So I go online and I order a couple movies from Netflix, and a few days later, the DVDs show up in the mail, right? So there were flaws with that model. Yes, it saved me from having to talk with my wife on the way home to argue about who was going to stop at Blockbuster to pick up that movie. It saved me from having to walk in and find some of those movies missing from the shelf, but I also had to wait. It didn't satisfy my impulsive nature to want to get what I needed right then and there. So what did Netflix do? Netflix disrupted itself. And they saw the streaming and the live streaming coming, and so they jumped on that bandwagon and completely went away from that model. And you see the quote here by Reed Hastings, the co-founder, short-term optimization about being efficient can often be the death of long-term success and innovation. And he says, we manage right on the edge of chaos. So in this particular instance, what he said was, I'm not going to go just adjust late fees, okay, like Blockbuster did when they did their customer satisfaction surveys and found that late fees were causing irritation amongst their customers. What they were doing is they were nibbling at the edge to try to create more short-term optimization. While Netflix was saying, you know what, I'm going to disrupt myself, nothing to do with late fees, I'm going to move into streaming, and I'm going to completely change the industry in the space. The point here is Reed Hastings, philosophically in his mind, the way he chose to disrupt the space was to say my company is going to live on the edge of chaos. They are going to exist right there so that we can be innovating and moving quickly as the customer needs shift and change. And that's exactly what's happened in our space. Now, one quick personal example. I was forced to operate at the edge of chaos. A number of years ago, where I live, we had a massive ice storm. The ice storm comes in, freezes the limbs on the trees fall down. It absolutely wreaked havoc on the local distribution system. So we were without power. We lose power. I say to my wife, don't worry, our neighborhood is underground. We'll have power back up in a matter of time. Okay, a day goes by. Now it's cold. It's winter when we had this freezing rain. We wake up the next morning, it's a little colder in the house, and we still don't have power. I said, don't worry, it's coming. We'll be fine. By day 3, when I woke up, and I could see my breath in the room, not because my breath was so horrible that morning, but because of how cold it was, okay? That's when I looked over at my wife, and she just looked at me and said, I'm leaving. Okay, now, I didn't know exactly what I'm leaving meant, but I immediately took action and contracted with a local contractor to come and install my own microgrid, my full whole house backup generator with automatic throwover, so that when I wasn't home, I didn't have to wheel the generator out and plug it in, and I had 100% resiliency on my entire house. I operated at the edge of chaos. Now, we are still married today, so she didn't leave permanently. But the threat worked. It pushed me right to the edge of taking action in a different way than I might otherwise have not taken that action. Okay? And suffice to say, it's still winter. I leave in comfort, knowing that if I have an outage at home, I have that automatic throwover switch to the whole house generator, and I paid dearly for that. But I operated at the very edge of chaos personally. All right? So this is what Netflix does. They shift and they say, we're going to act this way. And I think there's only a few physical bricks and mortar Blockbuster stores left. I think there's one left in Alaska that's about to close. I Googled it a few days ago. But the point is, if you sit still and you don't jump out and get ready to take action and figure out as leaders, what do we need to see around the corner to prepare ourselves and our companies and the entities in which we serve, we will lose. So the key is, how do we get ahead of this? Are companies prepared? So not too long ago, we, in conjunction with Green Biz Research, did some research with companies, about 240 companies, to say, what are you doing to compare? 85% of the companies that responded said, we feel prepared for the new energy future. I would interpret this as, hey, we've got this. We've got this under control. 85% said we're prepared. But then some of the other questions around what was underlying that level of preparedness made it a little more interesting. More than half said that they lacked a coordinated plan between internal teams, energy and sustainability teams, and they talked about that being a barrier to achieving their goals. So 85% said, we got this, but more than half said, well, we got it, but we've got internal barriers that prevent us oftentimes from taking action and really being aggressive in advancing the cause of energy efficiency, or how do we extract value from the assets that we either have or assets that we should have that make our operation better. More than half of these companies lacked a global energy data management strategy. So you probably heard Jean-Pascal talk this morning about connected devices. You've heard us talk about connection and the overall EcoStruxure platform. But in reality, most companies out here don't have a good strategy for how they take all this data that exists at the device level on up to the full enterprise and say, how are we going to use this? How are we going to analyze and synthesize this and turn this into intelligence that makes me better in my home, better in the way I live, better in the way I operate in my particular facility? Only 30% of these companies are considering advanced energy systems, such as how they could utilize storage, despite the dramatic drop in the cost of storage, the cost of solar, the cost of renewables, et cetera. So what we find is the lack of integration, not necessarily as connected as companies feel that they should be or are, and then maybe not as responsive to the changing needs and the changing dynamics of technologies that they can and should be taking advantage of. So I bring it back to us. What should we as leaders, because all of us are here at this event and all of you are in a leadership role in your company in some way, shape, or capacity. That doesn't mean you have to lead a team of thousands, but you are here for a reason. So the question for us as consumers, and actually prosumers and producers alike, is how do we as leaders need to act different? What do we need to do to see around the corner on behalf of our companies? And what it does is it requires a different way of thinking and a different way of taking action. One other personal story I'll share on this. A number of years ago, I was an energy manager for a large forest products company. And we had a similar freeze across the southern part of the United States, and the gas, natural gas that would feed our mills, feed our cogeneration plants, was frozen in, okay? Now, we had multi-pipeline access, so the gas that our mills needed to operate was still flowing, but the vast majority of the southern part of the US was shut off. Yet our plants could continue operating. We continued operating, and shortly after the event, I did some analysis of what the market price, the open market price for that natural gas would have been had we taken that gas and turned it back out into the system and remarketed that gas, okay, for others to consume, whether it be commercial, industrial, or residential properties. And then I went back to the mill manager. And basically what the analysis showed is we could have shut that mill, actually multiple mills, but that particular mill down, sent everybody home, paid them on a holiday for 2 or 3 days, and made more money in 6 months. I mean, made more money in those 3 days of the gas shortage being in effect than we would have made at the mill for 6 months. More profitable in terms of turning that gas back. So in effect, we needed to think differently about the commodities, the natural gas, the electricity, and the paper that was being produced at that particular mill, and think about it in a broader context. I thought I was going in as a hero to tell this mill manager, look at all the money we could make. Instead, the guy threw me out. He was so angry because I didn't prepare him. He was irritated because I, as a leader of the energy function in that company, had not gone through and seen around the corner to know what the opportunities are and know what's coming. Now, since that time, that particular mill, multiple occasions, has sent people home and turned that gas back in the market and made more money remarketing their gas than they have actually selling the output of the product at that particular facility. But at that particular time, I was no hero because I did not lead and I did not see around the corner. It required a new way of thinking. And I would propose and suggest that that same required new way of thinking exists in each one of our worlds that we come from. How do we have to imagine what's going to happen? How do we imagine what live streaming will do to the video rental store in a new and different way that we haven't thought of before? So here at Schneider and in the Energy and Sustainability Services Group, we look at this and frame this up in this fashion. We call it the journey to active energy management. And it encompasses these 3 things. Okay? It encompasses the procurement side. Many of you may not realize we're one of the largest third-party buyers on behalf of our clients in the world, both natural gas, electricity, and other fuels, renewables as well. But it requires companies to be very good in terms of how they buy. It requires companies to be very good in terms of how they consume and have a plan for how they approach the energy efficiency equation. And it requires the context of overall sustainability strategy. What are you doing to decarbonize? Where are you going to manage your carbon footprint? All 3 of these things are traditionally looked at in a company in 3 separate silos. And what we would argue is that those who are more advanced, and by the way, every end user in this room is on this journey, whether you want to admit it or not. The only question is, where are you on the journey? Because what's happening is these 3 things are converging. And these 3 things converge, and the closer they get together, the more active the energy management equation becomes. And so I would put another bubble right in the middle of the overlap of these 3, and I would call it active energy management, because as these 3 things converge, you are there to help them operate more sustainably, buy energy smarter, and consume those resources more efficiently than you ever have in the past. Now, what's happened is we have more and more technologies. Again, the blurry lines between assets in the digital world and the physical world are increasing. So as the pace increases and the amount of information increases, it's more incumbent on us to have the decision-making mechanisms, the algorithms, the predictive analytics to be able to manage this as effectively as we could. So this is what we refer to as the journey to active energy management. And a number of companies that we work with I could go on all day about different examples. I'm not going to steal too much thunder from Kurgrid because I'd encourage you to go to the panel where Edouard will be presenting this afternoon and talking about what they did. This is a utility in Brittany here in France that said first, they recognized that they were on a journey themselves. And so you can see some of the solutions that they implemented at the bottom with EV charging stations, a very sophisticated energy management program built on the EcoStruxure platform. They incorporated storage into it. You can see the solar panels on the roof of the headquarters. This is a picture of the headquarters. But what they did is they said, we're on this journey also because we're a consumer. So we need to consume just like an end user, much more efficiently than we have. So what they're doing now is now they're looking at, is it more cost effective instead of expanding transmission lines to bring more power in? Is it more cost effective to go work with our customers and roll out the same types of things at our customer locations in conjunction with our customers and avoid the cost of this expanded transmission line or more generation in other parts of the country? And so these guys aren't just walking the talk, they're helping their customers implement what they've implemented for themselves. Another example that I'll mention that's also on a panel later this afternoon, so I won't steal much of his thunder as well. Tomas is going to be talking about what they did in the IMT campus in Grenoble, where they've taken 7 buildings and they've said, we want to make our campus much more innovative than what it is today. We want to be much more efficient. We want to leverage renewable resources, and we want to leverage technologies in the energy management EcoStruxure platform to become much more effective at managing this and make it a showcase. And on top of that, we want our students to be involved in this so it can become a learning center. And he will talk more about this afternoon, but in effect, they have taken themselves on this journey and advancing it, and now they're optimizing between their own buildings, and I think they're building an 8th building, if I'm not mistaken, where it will be a state-of-the-art facility from an energy and sustainability perspective to leverage that overall footprint. Elbea's one more. I'm almost out of time, so I won't spend a lot of time. These guys are a bit earlier in their journey, but they spent a lot of time on the front end putting together an overall sustainability and carbon strategy, and now they're looking at the individual pieces of how do they buy better, how do they put together a comprehensive energy efficiency program across their sites, and how do they do this in the context of the goals and targets that they've set for themselves. So a number of different examples. I would encourage you to stop by a few of the places, and if you see these guys talking or attend the panel this afternoon to get a sense of how they got started on their journey, where they are on their journey, and I could go on about numerous other examples of companies in different places. But the fun part is all of you are on this same journey. So the real question is, what are all of you as leaders doing for your respective organizations to prepare yourselves for the future ecosystem of MeshGrid, where these assets and energy come together and blend in a completely different way than what we've seen in the past, where we integrate the energy and sustainability strategy along with the connected assets that were talked about by Jean-Pascal this morning and others on different panels. And then how do you take all that data and information, synthesize it in such a way that you can respond effectively to the market influences that are out there? So I can tell you this, the world is changing. The world's changing for grid operators, distribution utilities, end users, and we see this natural tension coming into play where customers want more control, customers want to optimize the resources themselves, they want to implement assets, whether they be renewable or on-site storage, et cetera, in such a way to change the way we live today in Industry 4.0. So I would encourage you, attend the session this afternoon to listen to these guys talk. Take advantage of the opportunity out here to visit with some of the booths and some of the people that are out there talking about how we're helping companies manage on this path. So thank you.